Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
And let us begin with the, all right, where is it? This is not what I want to share. Okay, get rid of this. There we are. The blessing for studying Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay.
Same day appointment.
So we're going to go backwards for a minute because there's a piece in the handout that I gave you that deals with something we read a couple of chapters ago. So we're going to briefly go back to chapter 22. All right. Okay, here we are. So this is, you may recall, if a man happens to meet in a town a virgin pledged to be married and he sleeps with her, she'll take both of them to the gate and stone them, etc., right? The young woman because she was in town and did not scream for help, and the man because he violated another man's wife. But if out in the country a man happens to meet a young woman pledged to be married and rapes her, only the man who has done this shall die. Do nothing to the woman. She has committed no sin deserving death. Okay? Okay, now we're going to switch to okay, you see Rachel Adler?
Yeah.
Good. All right, I just want to. Okay. Laws concerning women's sexual misconduct are grim testimonies to women's experiences in cultures where the lion's share of power and privilege goes to men. But before we can know what to do with these laws, we must clarify what they say and to whom they apply. Then we can ponder their implications. Kitetse, which is this passage in Deuteronomy 22, is a passage with unusual features for biblical legal texts. Its subject is sexual assault upon a me'urasha, a term often incorrectly translated as engaged woman. In ancient Israel, marriage occurred in two ceremonies a year apart. In the first, erusin, the man acquired exclusive rights to the woman. In the second,
I'm gonna get it for you.
could you guys please mute yourselves if you're going to be... Thank you. All right, so me'urasa is a term often incorrectly translated as engaged woman. In ancient Israel, marriage occurred in two ceremonies a year apart. In the first, erusin, the man acquired exclusive rights to the woman. In the second, nisuin, the marriage was consummated and the couple began to cohabit. During the medieval period, the two ceremonies were conflated. Zev Falk has named erusin inchoate marriage. After erusin, even though the marriage was unconsummated, a get, a divorce consent, would be necessary to dissolve it. The acquired woman is property, but of a peculiar kind. She is responsible for preventing her own misappropriation. How far does her responsibility extend? The answer depends on whether the woman can prove that she did not consent. The case in verses 23-24 is a rape in the city. If the woman was heard screaming, she can prove non-consent. Even if the rape is completed the act, if screams are attested, she is not liable. But this is a severe standard. Many women freeze under attack and cannot scream or resist. Consequently, some self-defense courses teach screaming. Moreover, is expecting help optimistic? In modern America, assault and murder cases occur in which the victim screams, summon no assistance. And we discussed this actually when we, went through this passage, but Rachel Adler was in the middle of another set of commentaries. The second case, verses 25-27, is a rape in open country. Here, oddly, biblical law, which is notoriously terse, expends 3 verses on its ruling. Verse 25 would suffice for a legal ruling, but if the man comes upon the me'urasah in open country and attacks her and rapes her, only the man who lay with her shall die. But the text continues, insisting for 2 more verses and 4 different clauses that the girl must not be put to death. Verse 26 harangues, you shall do nothing to the girl. The girl did not incur the death penalty. This case is like that of one man attacking another to murder him. Verse 27 continues, analogizing to male-on-male assault. He came upon her in the open. Though the me'urasah screamed for help, there was no one to save her. Why must the text tell us repeatedly not to kill the girl? In the Near East, ancient and modern, and even into Pakistan and India, a custom called honor killing has not been eradicated to this day. A girl whose kin believes she has been sexually polluted is killed to preserve the family honor. Whether she resisted or consented is irrelevant. They dispose of her like a toothbrush misappropriated by someone not its owner. The unusual wordiness of our Deuteronomy text makes sense if it is prohibiting honor killing to people who are accustomed to practice it. The prohibition would be a hard sell. Deuteronomy must recast rape as a violent crime akin to violence against males. Also, redefining lack of chastity not as pollution, but as moral choice requires Deuteronomy to regard women as moral actors and not spoiled toothbrushes. This is the beginning of a moral revolution. It is hardly the end of the revolution. I have argued, following the legal theorist Robert Cover, that law flows from nomos, a moral universe constituted through stories. As we tell new stories and hear stories that were previously silenced, we build a bridge from the known moral universe to the new moral universe we envision. Deuteronomy began the process. Me Too stories and our responses to them drive the new vision. Our job is to get out there and work on that bridge. So, despite the fact that we were kind of horrified by, all of these stories about rape and who's responsible and who isn't, and whether the woman screams or not, and whether, she is likely to get help or not, the fact is, according to Rachel Adler, this is actually a little bit of an advance. Because if a woman is raped and it's clear that she did not consent, she's not considered to be polluted and therefore must be killed. And it may seem like a small advance, but it is nonetheless an advance. In other words, as she says, we're ascribing some moral agency to the woman here, that she's not just an object who has been polluted. She's someone who can actually object to what's happening. And there's assumptions made about the country and the city and whether she screamed or not. And there's obviously an issue around that because you might freeze and not scream. But the idea here is that, if she, in fact, did object, she is considered to have, not been a soiled object. So small comfort, but some comfort, right? Some tiny advance. Go ahead, Jason.
I'm trying to remember, because this really parses to this very specific group of women, and it doesn't necessarily expand to if it's a married woman, right? Or an unengaged, unmarried woman, right? Those things are still in different categories. Am I right?
Well, I guess if she's already married, she's not a virgin. So there's an issue around the virgin, right? Because if she gets raped by somebody.
But is the man's punishment the same regardless?
Now remember, if she's not engaged and he rapes her, he has to marry her. If
But
she's
you can't
engaged,
marry her if she's married.
And if she's married, then
Then
I
it's
guess,
a crime against the man as the husband.
Yeah.
Yes, and that logic. But I assume he still has the same punishment, right?
I would think so. Let me just see if this particular or the other one has. You know what? This one usually has legal. Let me just look here. See if it has something.
It's just there's, as you know, there's areas where they say so much, and then there's areas where they don't say near enough.
Well, then the Talmud would go ahead and let's see. Well, see, it says here in this book, this is the Eitz Chaim, it says adultery with a married woman. So I think that, let's see.
So if you're married, it's automatically consent? See, that's not right.
No. I think what they're saying here is if she's engaged and this happens, here's the consequence. All the more so if she's actually married. In both cases, the bride price has already been paid and she's considered, I mean, you have to get a divorce once you're engaged, so-called engaged.
And Suzanne makes an interesting point in the chat.
Oh, I didn't see.
There are many cases where I think our Torah is really advanced in understanding the human brain and emotions. This seems to be one where they might have just not really understood
Of course
voluntary and involuntary responses.
Right.
But there are a lot of places where they really had insight that held up.
Well, this is a woman's being raped. I don't know if they really get it. Suzanne, you may have come in a little bit late, but the material I was reading from Rachel Adler in the handout, she was saying that self-defense classes actually teach women to scream because women do often freeze, which is very understandable. You're just like so stunned and afraid. So that's, definitely the case. But I think that, whether you're married or just so-called engaged, I would think the same punishment would be the case. Says, adultery is also a capital crime in other ancient Near Eastern law collections because the latter consider it an offense solely against the woman's husband, however. They permit the husband or the king to spare the wife and her lover or to impose a lesser punishment. The Bible views God as the author of the laws because God has forbidden adultery. It is a sin against him as well as the husband, and therefore no human has a right to commute the punishment. So I do think it's the same for marriage. The self-defense classes are wrong. Okay, well, what can I say? I'm just quoting what Rachel Adler said. Okay, so, and whether they succeed in teaching them or not, I don't know. But it would seem to me it'd be pretty difficult to teach someone to scream if it's a neurologically driven defense. The whole thing is ghoulish to begin with anyway. And whether she screams or not and all of that, I mean, it's clearly written from a very male-centered place. All right, let's go on to the next one is about another divorce situation. So let's look at we have to read the, here we go. So we're going to go to 24. Okay. Let me move this over. Okay. Doug, would you like, oopsie, I don't want to make it that big. Would you like to start reading?
Absolutely. Can you hear me? Because my microphone
was
on.
I can hear you.
Oh, good. All right. So if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house, she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again and after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance.
So you see, we haven't really, gotten away from this idea of a woman being defiled, right? And so, but I just want to read you in this other text that Lynn has. She fails to please him. If she ceases to please him, by itself, this clause implies that a husband could divorce his wife for any reason, however subjective. This is how the law was understood by Josephus, the school of Hillel, and Rabbi Akiva. So all of a sudden she gets a wart on her face or something, and I don't like her anymore, goodbye. It's pretty horrible. Some commentators believe that the following clause, because he finds something obnoxious about her, is intended to restrict this right to a single reason. I don't know why that's better. There's one reason rather than 15. However, this law was not written to present the rules for divorce, but to describe one of its consequences. And it's likely that the following clause simply refers to the most common type of reason, but not the only one permitted. The husband's latitude was eventually abolished for Ashkenazic Jewry by a takana, which is a rabbinic enactment, issued by Rabbeinu Gershom. Now, Rabbeinu Gershom, by the way, is also the one who said that a husband cannot have more than one wife unless 100 rabbis agree to it, which occasionally people are able to muster 100 rabbis to do that. So this takana by Rabbeinu Gershom prohibits the husband from divorcing his wife against her will, except for a legally compelling reason such as apostasy or refusal of conjugal rights. Now, I'm not really sure how this works, because basically when you want to issue a get, a divorce decree, you have somebody, it could be a messenger, she has to accept it into her hands, which I guess assumes some sort of a consent, but as long as you somehow get it into her hands, I mean, that's against her will in some cases. So I don't see how that constitutes her will, but nonetheless, the idea is, that somehow you don't just divorce her against her will. Now, it is true that in a case where, for example, let's say the wife has Alzheimer's and you decide you want to divorce her, you really can't. Okay, in Jewish law, even today, I mean, civically you can, but not in terms of Jewish law, because she can't consent to it, right? Because she has Alzheimer's, or let's say she's crazy or whatever, so you actually cannot. And I actually have a colleague whose wife had Huntington's disease. And I mean, I don't think he wanted to divorce her, but he did live with someone else while she was in a nursing home. And, that was kind of a touchy subject because he was a rabbi. But, he could, he did take care of her, but she was no longer able to be at home, and she wasn't really completely conscious and all of that. But it's a tricky situation. So he writes her a bill of divorcement and sends her away. Sends her away, that's the language that's used for being divorced. So divorce is initiated by the husband. And that's still the case today, as you probably know, that there are women who are aguna, which means chained, because their husbands won't give them a divorce. This is the norm in the Bible and elsewhere in the ancient Near East, and is clearly the case in the present law. It's possible, however, that in certain circumstances, the wife might initiate it. By the way, did anyone see that film called Get, where this wife is it's a very good film. It's an Israeli film. She's, trying to get a divorce. Virtually impossible. I mean, you can, maybe get the Beit Din to eventually compel the husband in some way or another, but it's really a tough situation. So according to Exodus 21, a girl sold for the purpose of marriage must be given her freedom if her master does not provide her basic necessities. Assuming that the rights of free women were not less than those of such girls, it seems to imply that a wife could initiate the dissolution of the marriage on the grounds of non-support. Because the ketubah, this is post-biblical, the ketubah says the man must provide her with food, housing, clothing, and sex. Okay, and if somehow he doesn't provide her with those things, I guess she has some grounds for divorce. Furthermore, a number of ancient Near Eastern marriage contracts stipulate that either the husband or the wife may initiate divorce, and similar provisions are known in Palestinian Jewish marriage contracts down into the Middle Ages. So it's not out of the question that some women had this right in biblical Israel too, at least if it was stipulated in the marriage agreement. Halachic sources recognize a number of cases in which a wife may petition the court to compel her husband to grant a divorce, such as non-support, beating, and fornication. So, yeah, as I said, it's not easy to get the husband to do it if he doesn't want to, for whatever the reason is. I mean, for example, in the ketubah, he owes her a certain property. He may not want to give that up. Okay, so any comments about that before we go on?
My daughter Michelle has an Israeli friend, and she was married in Israel, and her husband beat her, and she came to the States, and he wouldn't give her a divorce.
There you
So
go.
finally, they paid him a lot of money, and he gave her the divorce.
Well, what they do in some of the modern Orthodox communities is if the husband doesn't want to give a divorce, I mean, There actually was a case not too many years ago where the guy got 100 rabbis to let him marry somebody else, so he had two wives, and he wouldn't give a divorce to the first one.
Really?
Yeah, but because all you need is 100 rabbis. That's the Takana from Rabbeinu Gershon. So anyway, but let's say the husband doesn't want to give a divorce, and it's legitimate that he should, and whatever. I mean, they can kind of shame him in the community and kind of force him to do it. But sometimes the guy disappears. What if he just disappears? You don't know where he is, if he's alive or not. You're stuck.
Then she's changed. He can't do anything.
That's why there's this problem of aguna. It's really, really horrible in modern Orthodox, or modern, in the modern world, in Orthodox communities.
Are there any movements to try to change that?
Well, the conservative movement has added a, what's it called? It's a provision in the marriage contract. I can't remember what it's called. I have a file with all this material, but where the woman can initiate a divorce if she needs to, and all of that. And I can send you stuff about that if you want. I have some material on that. Let me just quickly see if I can find it. Wait 1 second. I think I have it in, look, if I can quickly find it, I will. Let's see.
Suzanne?
Yeah,
So in the U.S., where we're subject to U.S. law as opposed to religious law with Sharia or with the Torah, does any of this really apply anymore?
it applies in the sense that you can get a civil divorce, but here, I'm going to share this. You can get a civil divorce, however, in the community where you're living, wait a minute. I'm trying to get this. Okay. Oh, please. I don't want to join your newsletter. Darn it. I don't want it. How do I get out of this thing?
Escape.
Okay, here we are. All right. Am I sharing the screen or not?
No.
All right. So before I go, all right. So in the modern world where you can get a civil divorce, yes, you can get a divorce. However, if you live in an Orthodox community, you are still considered married until you get a get. So it does apply, unless you want to say, I don't care what
Right.
my community says, right? Can't really get out of that. And even in the conservative world, so
That's not, I mean, the vast majority of people.
I'm sorry, you're cutting out, so I couldn't understand what you were saying. You froze. Okay, so let me try to share.
Is it not also an issue where it's
Yeah, we're
impacting because as you go throughout the Orthodox world, like when I was in South Africa, there was a really interesting situation where a woman had gone from Israel to South Africa, but in order for her to live within an Orthodox community in Cape Town, this would be an issue because her husband in Israel would notify the Orthodox community
Sure.
in Cape Town.
Sure.
And if she were to go from Cape Town to Joburg, it would be the exact same thing. Then Cape Town, it basically would follow the woman wherever she went.
Right.
She wouldn't be able to be fully accepted
Absolutely.
or integrated within society. And there was this constant component that you are married and your husband is in Israel.
Absolutely. So
And
here, so can you guys see this potential solutions to the Aguna problem?
Yeah.
yes.
All right. So when a husband refuses to grant a Jewish divorce to his wife, she's an aguna, chained, right? Were she to marry again without a get, any children she bears would be considered mamzerim. That doesn't mean bastards, but it means that they're at a lower level than other Israelites, and they're only allowed to marry other mamzerims. Okay. Now, of course, in Israel, that's where marriage and divorce are handled by the Beit Din. And there's one that's specifically dedicated to resolving divorces. Okay, a lot of noise, folks. Could you Mute whoever's doing that. Okay. See, there she is chained. So in America, most divorcing parties are not subject to the Beit Din, and the Beit Din can't enforce anything. However, again, if you're in a Orthodox community, it doesn't matter whether the courts in this country have jurisdiction or not. And then in Israel, so in Israel, if you want to get divorced, you have to go through the Beit Din, I hate all these ads. God. In Israel, if you want a divorce, you do have to go through the Beit Din. There's no civil divorce at all. Okay. And then in Israel, you can petition the rabbinical court to decide whether there's a grounds for divorce, and the court can compel the husband. Okay. All right. Now I want to see if there's the conservative movement. Okay, here we are. Yes, here it is. Okay, according to okay, where's the one? There, I'm trying to find the oh, here it is, the Lieberman Clause. That's what it's called. Conservative rabbis do require a get, and the conservative movement has worked hard to find solutions to the Aguna problem and yet remain faithful to tradition. Under the leadership of Rabbi Saul Lieberman, the idea of an appendage to the ketubah was introduced, known as the Lieberman Clause. It states that if the marriage ends in a civil divorce and either spouse refuses to participate in the get procedures, the matter will go before a Beit Din and the parties would be bound by the rabbinical court's decision. If the recalcitrant party would refuse to go before the Beit Din or follow its ruling, compensation would be imposed and enforceable by a secular court, since it would constitute a breach of contract. So this is not obviously perfect, because you still have to go before a Beit Din. And what if the Beit Din says, we don't agree that you should have a divorce? Then you're in trouble. But there is this clause that gives you the possibility of following the civil court. So I'm going to, I can send that out to you guys if you want. You can read more about it on your own. Are there any other
Rabbi,
questions?
I
Yeah.
do have a question.
Yeah.
So then the whole situation in Israel with going to Cyprus to get married and divorced actually has nothing, only has to do with civil marriage. So for example, if you're Reform and you're in Israel, you can't get married in Israel. So that then what you're doing is going to Cyprus to get a civil marriage, which
Okay.
means you also have to return to Cyprus to get a civil divorce.
The latter is correct. It's not that if you're a Reformed Jew, you can't get married in Israel. It is that you have to get married by an Orthodox rabbi. And there are people who either do not want to get married by an Orthodox rabbi, they resent the fact that that's the law, or they're not particularly religious and they don't want to get married by a rabbi or whatever, or they, let's say, went through a conservative or reform conversion, and they're not recognized as Jews by the rabbinate, and therefore they would not marry you. So there are all these possible circumstances under which you would not get married in Israel. So yes, people, well, if you're already married, once you get to Israel, it's recognized. You don't have to get married again, and you don't need a religious marriage. It's just that there's no such thing as civil marriage in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, if you go to Cyprus to get married, so you don't have to go through the whole rabbinical,
If you were married by a Reformed Jew, a Reformed marriage, it would be accepted in Israel if you moved to Israel?
any marriage that's performed outside of Israel that's recognized by the country that you're from is accepted. It's just that once you're in Israel, you cannot get married. Like I could not, if I were, let's say, an Israeli rabbi, I could not perform a legitimate legal marriage. So, I mean, sometimes there's a Reform rabbi who might do it with an Orthodox rabbi.
But your marriage to Jordan, would be
Yes,
accepted even though you were married by a Reform rabbi.
right. All of us, all our marriages would be accepted.
And your children would be accepted.
Well, in my case, because yeah, I was born to two Jews, etc., or Jewish mother. But if, let's say, I had converted and I had a kid, my marriage would be accepted, my kid would not be considered Jewish by the rabbis. And so that kid
Wow.
could not get married in Israel.
Wow.
But the
Yeah.
child could convert, couldn't they?
They could convert with an Orthodox rabbi
Right.
only. That's the only thing that's recognized there. So, yes, and then if you want to get divorced, you need to be in Cyprus. However, you can't just go to Cyprus and get a divorce. I think you have to have lived there for like 6 months or something to get a divorce. That's the problem. It's not like one of those Mexican divorces where you can just go to Mexico and you know, which is what my parents did actually. But anyway, yeah, you have to live in, you know, so it's not so easy. So if you get married and, you know, because also if, let's just say I decide I'm going to get married in Israel by an Orthodox rabbi. Okay, I accept that. If I want to get divorced, first of all, my husband has to give it to me. And I have to accept what they decide. Even if, let's say, I don't know, let's say they don't even accept a conservative rabbi, but like if we had a Lieberman clause in our ketubah, which the Orthodox would not recognize, but let's just say they did, I'd have to go to the Beit Din and accept what they decided. So this is why
I guess that was part of where my question was, is that if you, and that's, so since you, if you're Israeli and you're a couple and you're mostly secular, but you decide you're going to go ahead and get married in Israel, then you're going to be doing that with an Orthodox rabbi, which means you're also bound by the specific components, which means it's going to the Bet Din. If as a woman, you felt that that was not acceptable, you weren't going to be under those terms. Your only option, if you're living in Israel and you're not married, would be to go someplace else. The closest place you can go to would be Cyprus.
Yeah.
But again, even in that situation, if you were to divorce, you don't just go over to Cyprus to get it. You still have to go through a process. You're still having to spend time in Cyprus. You're having to give up your job in order to go live in Cyprus in order to be granted a divorce. It isn't something, especially in this situation for a woman, because the man still holds the power in that situation.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Which is why the reform and conservative movements in Israel have been pushing for civil marriage. You know, why can't there be that option? Why does it have to be, you know, either an imam, a priest, you know, a pastor or a rabbi doing the marriage? It's not supposed to be a, you know, religious state, even though in many ways it is. So we haven't made a lot of progress because the last government, which is the Netanyahu-Gantz coalition, is giving a lot of power to the religious parties once again. So I don't see a lot of hope for this right now. Okay, any other comments before we move on to the next? Okay, so let me find Deuteronomy. Where is it? Okay. Let's see. Here we are. All right. You want to keep reading, Doug?
Sure. Once I
Wait, I just want to make sure to divorce and allowed to marry again. Here. 5, yeah.
At 5? Yep.
Yeah.
So if a man has recently married, he must not be sent to war or have any other duty laid on him. For 1 year, he is to be free to stay at home and bring happiness to the wife he has married.
So
You know,
you remember we read this a few chapters ago about the exemptions for going to war. One of them is that if you're engaged to be married. One is if you've put a vineyard together and you haven't yet been able to enjoy the fruits of your labor. And the other is if you're building a house. Remember that? And then people who are too afraid to go are exempt. Okay.
do not take a pair of millstones, not even the upper one, as security for a debt, because that would be taking a person's livelihood as security.
So
If someone,
so here's the thing: when somebody borrows money, they're allowed to have some sort of pledge, right, to make sure they pay back. And they're pretty careful about the kinds of things like you're not allowed to take the person's, you know, cloak, which may be the only thing this poor guy has, right? And the millstone is something that the person is using to make a living. So you can't like take that away from them either. Okay.
if someone is caught kidnapping a fellow Israelite and treating or selling them as a slave, the kidnapper must die. You must purge the evil from among you. In cases of defiling skin diseases, be very careful to do exactly as the Levitical priests instruct you. You must follow carefully what I have commanded them. Remember that the Lord your God did to Miriam along the way after you came out of Egypt.
Okay, let me just stop 1 second here because as far as the kidnapping goes, all right, so obviously you can't kidnap somebody and ransom them, right? But there's a difference between, remember, Exodus and Deuteronomy don't always agree. Two different sources or Moses's commentary on Exodus. So here it says it's hard to harmonize the difference between Exodus and Deuteronomy regarding the nationality of the victim. The wording here, literally your fellow, one of the Israelites, explicitly restricts the law to Israelite victims. Presumably, it would punish the kidnapping of resident aliens and foreigners in some other way. This is the case in the Hittite laws, where the penalty depends on the nationality of the victim. Unless we assume, as halachic exegesis does, that Exodus implicitly refers only to Israelite victims, Deuteronomy seems to represent a modification of the law in Exodus, because Exodus is much broader than the one in Deuteronomy. And they're just saying it's kind of surprising because otherwise there's a lot of material in Deuteronomy that concerns itself with the welfare of resident aliens. So this commentary doesn't quite understand why it doesn't broaden the kidnapping issue. And remember, with leprosy, or they call it leprosy, it's not correct, the skin ailment, that sara'at, right? That it's a priest who's supposed to come and make sure that you're okay. And there's also a difference here between what we read in Leviticus and what we're reading in Deuteronomy. The present passage illustrates the difference between Deuteronomy, which is entirely addressed to the public, and Leviticus, much of which consists of professional lore addressed to the priests. So Leviticus was talking to the priests about how they're supposed to decide whether someone still has the ailment and should be taken out of the camp for 7 days or whether they can come back. The technical details of leprosy are too complicated for non-specialists, but because leprous affections created ritual impurity, the public had to be reminded to scrupulously submit them to the judgment of those qualified to diagnose them correctly. For those of you who were with us when we were reading Leviticus, and I think Sandy and Lynn and Jason, I don't know if anybody else was with us, when your doctor, Felicia, came and showed us these pictures of this kind of skin ailment. It's not, you might have been there, Rosalie, as well. It's not leprosy. It's some sort of skin ailment, which apparently, according to this dermatologist, in fact, in 7 days, sometimes does resolve itself. Now, why the priest is the expert on skin ailments, I don't know. But, but I mean, I know only in the sense that if you have a skin ailment, meaning there's something different about you than, a normal, healthy appearance, then you're creating some sort of ritual impurity for the camp. And so you definitely, have to be removed because the camp has to remain pure to make sure that God's presence does not leave it. Sandy, did you want to say something about it? Or?
No.
Okay. And those pictures were really kind of gross, but.
Oh, I wasn't there that day.
Oh, you weren't there? And it was your doctor? No. Okay.
It was my doctor, but I wasn't there.
Oh, okay. I'm sure she'd be happy to show it to you next time you see it.
I actually think I missed that somehow too.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, I don't remember actually seeing.
Oh, wow. Okay,
sure
she brought a book with all these illustrations of all these skin diseases.
But I mean, in terms of medicine, I mean, there really weren't anything close to actual knowledgeable doctors until very recently, right? I mean, it was all medicine men, right? Priests, whoever it was, right? There was no.
Right. But it's also because it's about purity, ritual purity, and that's what the priests were in charge of, right? So, okay. All right, let me go back to the, sorry to interrupt. Oh no, that's not what we want. We want this. Nope. Here we are. Okay. Doug, if you'd like to continue.
Yes, once I figure out where I'm at.
Here we are, 10, verse 10.
There we are. Okay, sorry. Okay. I had to move you all over to one side. So there
Yeah,
we go.
right.
When you make a loan of any kind to your neighbor, do not go into their house to get what is offered to you as a pledge. Stay outside and let the neighbor to whom you are making the loan bring the pledge out to you. If the neighbor is poor, do not go to sleep with their pledge in your possession. Return their cloak by sunset so that your neighbor may sleep in it. Then they will thank you, and it will be regarded as a righteous act on the side of the Lord your God. Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether the worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns. Pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they are poor and are counting on it. Otherwise, they may cry to the Lord against you, and you'll be guilty of sin.
I wrote my whole rabbinic thesis on these kinds of laws about paying your workers on time and all of that. So there is a whole tradition in Judaism of treating your worker decently, which might explain why Jews were involved in the labor movement, in the earlier part of the 20th century. And notice here, again, it says your fellow Israelite or a foreigner. So many times they include the resident alien, the stranger in the Deuteronomic laws, and yet the kidnapping one seems to only focus on Israelites, which is strange, but anyhow. Please keep going.
Parents are not to be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their parents. Each will die for their own sin.
Now, this is interesting. Okay, let me just stop you for a moment. Sorry. Transgenerational punishment is forbidden. Because, do you remember in other places it'll say that the sins of the fathers will be visited upon the children unto the fourth generation or whatever. So it says that although it is recognized, even in Deuteronomy, that God punishes descendants for their ancestors' wrongs, that is solely a divine prerogative. Human authorities may not act likewise. That the verse here refers to execution by human judicial authorities is clear from the verb yumat, which always refers to judicial execution, not divine punishment. Elsewhere in ancient Near Eastern law, the notion that members of a man's family were an extension of his own personality, rather than individuals in their own right, was sometimes taken to such an extreme that if a man harmed a member of another man's family, he was punished by the same harm being done to a member of his own family, often the corresponding member. Remember the whole eye for an eye. At other times, an offender's family might be punished along with him. And so this is important to keep in mind, that there really isn't a sense of an individual as an individual, in the Bible. You're really part of a family and a clan and a tribe, and there isn't that same sense of individual rights. So it says, while these were not necessarily universal practices, no explicit prohibition of them is known prior to Deuteronomy. There is, however, an implicit renunciation of the practice in Exodus, which rules that the owner of a goring ox is to be punished personally whether the ox gores an adult or a child. In other words, the owner's child is not to be punished if the victim was a child. So even though if the ox gores a child, supposedly you can go kill the guy's kid, no. The few instances where punishment of children was legally sanctioned were not criminal cases, but those involving offenses against God, such as violations of the herem, which is the excommunication, and national oaths. The Bible and other ancient sources mention cases of the execution of the entire family of those guilty of treason, as well as the families of kings whose dynasties were overthrown. Now, in Israel, that if there's, let's say, a Palestinian terrorist, I put in quotes, who does something, a lot of times the Israeli defense forces will go and destroy the house of the family. They won't kill the family members, but they'll destroy the house. Too close for this. people may not be executed or even convicted on the strength of a relative's testimony, and hence relatives may not even testify about each other. Okay. All right, so just to see that, the eye for an eye kind of thing is a way to respond to this sort of, blood revenge, that you can't go hurt somebody else in someone's family because of what the person did. I mean, they're trying to limit that kind of blood revenge. Even though eye for an eye sounds horrible, it's better than what happened before that. Okay, so we'll go on. Okay, here we are. Verse 17.
Do not deprive the foreigner or the fatherless of justice, or take the cloak of the widow as a pledge. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. That is why I command you to do this. When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this.
So this is the sort of food, what's it called, like Arlington Temporary, for people who are poor. You can't, remember also the corners of the fields you're not allowed to harvest. So it's the corner of the fields, the stuff that you leave behind. You don't go back and pick it up. There are 4 categories, apparently, of food that you're supposed to leave for the poor. So the edge of the field, which is called peah, what is forgotten in the fields, vineyards and groves, which is shechacha. Then grain and grapes that fall to the ground during reaping, which is leket and peret, and small immature clusters of grapes, ololot. And there's a whole tractate in the Talmud that deals with all of this. So this is the food bank that is there for those who cannot feed themselves. So we're going to go on to a little bit in the next chapter. Okay, we're just going to read the first paragraph. Please.
Sorry. Little techno glitch. All right.
Okay.
So when people have a dispute, they are to take it to court, and the judges will decide the case, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty. If the guilty person deserves to be beaten, the judge shall make them lie down and have them flogged in his presence with the number of lashes the crime deserves.
Okay.
But the judge must
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
But the judge must not impose more than 40 lashes. If the guilty party is flogged more than that, your fellow Israelite will be degraded in your eyes.
Thank you. Okay, so this is a verse or a series of verses that I have used in criminal justice work that I've done, and I want to share with you what one of my colleagues has written about it. Open this up a little bit more. So, Respecting the Criminal, this is by Rabbi Melanie Aaron, and she's quoting this whole series of verses. In ancient Israel, there was no long-term imprisonment. Isn't that interesting? No long-term, even though we give people, even 14-year-olds in this country, life without the possibility of parole. Okay, that did not exist in ancient Israel. People were held until their case could be heard, but the choices for punishment were fines and lashes, or in the most extreme cases, the death penalty. So even though the death penalty was usually not imposed by a Jewish court for various reasons, sometimes there were ways in which by default it was imposed. Like they would give somebody something to drink or eat that would make their stomach sort of explode. But anyway, in the Bible, it's primarily the great empires who imprison their fellow human beings, though some of the kings of Judah and Israel follow suit on occasion, not to their credit. We've had some of the prophets stuck in jail. For example, Jeremiah was in jail and Isaiah. They don't The rulers don't want to hear what they have to say. Throughout Jewish history, redeeming someone held captive, including someone held in prison, has been a major mitzvah. Redeeming captives is so important that we can take money designated for schools or to help the poor to do so. For Maimonides, redeeming captives comes before sustaining the poor or clothing them, and there is no greater obligation than redeeming captives. And you don't have a greater obligation than redeeming captives. Okay, repeated twice, obviously he means it. It is one of only a small list of mitzvot mentioned in the list of God's great deeds in the Gevrot prayer. And that's what we recite. Matir Asurim means literally freeing the captive. As Jewish law developed, there were two categories of cases. Dine nefashot, cases dealing with persons, and dine mamonot, cases dealing with property. Crimes that involved only property could be punished only with fines. The focus was on restitution to the victim. Restitution not only of the stolen object, but also restitution for loss of use, hardship, and so on. There was no perceived need to separate the criminal from society in this category of cases. Isn't that interesting when you think about who's in jail these days? The question of what kind of case is punished by lashes is raised in the commentaries. Based on the law that follows our text regarding the muzzling of an ox, the commentaries conclude that it must be a negative commandment, which cannot be rectified by a positive action. Returning to our biblical text, we find tremendous concern for the criminal, both in the text itself and in the rabbinic commentaries and applications. We note, first of all, the limitations on the punishment of the guilty offender, and that's in the Talmud. The punishment must be proportional to the crime and must be done in the presence of the judge. Later in rabbinic practice, this becomes 3 judges. Punishment is never to be more than 40 lashes, and traditionally the count was 39, so as to avoid accidentally exceeding the law. Like 3 strikes and you're out, right? That 3rd video that you stole, now you're in prison for a really long time. This is supposedly a way to stop us from exceeding the punishment. Rashi offers this explanation. Because of its vowels, the word b'mispar means a count of and not the count of in the phrase b'mispar arba'ah, a count of 40. The physical condition of the guilty party was taken into consideration, along with his ability to withstand judgment. In other words, right now we have people in jail who are possibly exposed to COVID-19, and our particular sheriff will not let anybody out because he said if you didn't want to get sick, you shouldn't have gone to jail. Well, there's some people who have underlying medical conditions, who are older, who should be considered for release. However, he will not do that. And he's not the only one. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, after being called the wicked through the first 2 verses, in the 3rd verse, the perpetrator is called your brother, reaffirming his commonality with you, the member of the community hearing these laws. So these are not criminals who are different from us. These are other human beings who are like us, and we should believe that we need to respect them in some way and treat them with dignity. The affirmation that once the criminal has been punished, paid his debt to society, is able to return and be a member of the community is consistent with other aspects of the Jewish treatment of the criminal. Over the years, concern was expressed in halachic discussions that the punishment imposed not prevent teshuvah. Teshuvah means kind of repentance and return. The goal was the return of the wicked to the ways of righteousness. It was understood that in some cases, the punishment itself could be a barrier to repentance. Think about the fact that, first of all, if you're going to be in prison for any period of time, but certainly for lengthy periods of time, you are humiliated and exposed to violence and exposed to all sorts of awful things. Then you get out and you can't get a job and you can't find a place to live. And if you have a mental illness or an addiction to drugs, you're not necessarily going to get treatment for those things. That's not in keeping with how we understand Jewish law in any event. So the goal was the return of the wicked to the ways of righteousness. It was understood in some cases the punishment itself could be a barrier to repentance. There was concern that overly harsh punishment would drive an individual out of the community and into a lifetime of bad behavior. In both the Bible and Talmud, a person who has done teshuvah is no longer considered a sinner. So you've paid your debt to society, you're very eager to go back and to do what's right, and you're not given that opportunity in many cases in our society. If he has repented, been sentenced, and made restitution, he is eligible to fully return to society. If a priest, he can resume his service in the temple. Since the fall of the temple, he may be called up for the honor of Torah reading. Our reform movement passed various resolutions related to the criminal justice system, addressing juvenile justice as early as 1936 and race and the criminal justice system as recently as 1999. Of course, this is all very relevant today when you think about all the people being killed by the police. Passing a $20 counterfeit, or at least accused of passing a counterfeit $20 bill, results in your being killed by the police. That just is not justice. State Assembly member Jim Beal made an impassioned plea that we pay more attention to what is going on in our prison system. He argued that directly and indirectly, the growth of California's prison population is a major contributor to our state's budget crisis. So California, which everyone considers to be so progressive and is progressive in many ways, when it comes to criminal justice, not so much. In the last 30 or 40 years, we've built a bunch of new prisons and no new universities. I'm not sure how many decades to be accurate, but it costs something like $70,000 a year for someone to be in prison in this state. You could go to Harvard for that money, right? So why are we spending money locking people away and giving them even fewer opportunities for re-entering society in a positive way? And a lot of these people will re-enter society, and do we want them to be in, worse shape than they were when they went in? Funds needed for education, health, and other human services go instead to building and maintaining larger and larger prisons. Rehabilitation has lost support, to some extent based on the argument of sociologist Robert Martinson that there was no evidence that rehabilitation programs reduced recidivism, an argument that he later retracted. Recidivism is something like at least 60%, so something is not being done correctly. And at least for some people, the argument of how much money we're spending on the prison system is more persuasive than some of these other arguments. As programs such as the Pell Grants for education in jail have been eliminated, there have been enormous increases in the rates of recidivism. By the way, there's a wonderful series of documentaries called College Behind Bars. It's 4 documentaries about a program from Bard College where they are helping people in prison earn college degrees. And guess what? The recidivism rate for people who earn college degrees is like 3%. Pell Grants are grants that were given to people, but were once given to people in prison to be able to attend college, and those were eliminated. So there are fewer and fewer programs available for people to actually earn a college degree.
Isn't that the program where some of the people beat the Harvard debate team or something? There was a
I think
story,
so.
and
I think so. Yeah.
about that. I mean, it just goes to show what you can get from people when you give them an opportunity.
Absolutely.
And don't pretend that they don't deserve it and can't live up to
Absolutely.
it.
California joined many other states in replacing parole with a 3 strikes policy and in lowering the age that juveniles are tried as adults. In addition, 1 of every 11 prisoners is serving a life sentence, an 83% increase since 1992, leading to a large population of elderly jail inmates. Now, elderly inmates are very unlikely to commit more crimes. The foundational Jewish concept of Tselem Elohim, the mitzvah of remembering that every human being was created in God's image, and Kavod HaBriyot, the honor due to every human being, offer an important message necessary to balance the overwhelming dehumanization of the prisoner. Tselem Elohim in Jewish law has meant that it is necessary to maintain the dignity of every human being even during punishment. Our current criminal justice system includes much that is inhumane and ineffective. For moral and fiscal reasons, it is time for good people of all faiths to involve themselves in reform efforts. Okay, sorry to be a little preachy about this, but this is my main cause, and I think I love this essay that Melanie Aaron wrote, because I think it's just so absolutely accurate, and it's just a tragedy what we're doing to people in these prisons. Any other thoughts about this?
Well, that's a great essay, Rabbi. I very much appreciated that. I know that we talk a lot within the public education system of how much, how much the state allocates per student for average daily attendance, and you calculate everything else out, and then you determine how much is actually spent within our prison system and our overall justice system. And again, once you start eliminating, or once we eliminated Pell Grants, which was federal, not state, but again, supporting individuals who are in prison without educational opportunities. And then even with the intention of not being life, with the intention of shorter sentences and individuals getting out, oftentimes when you compound a reduction or lack of educational opportunities previous to imprisonment, which was often some of the cases that led to the systemic poverty that led them into prison. If you take that component, if you take the mental health components, if you compound all those out, what you ultimately have as individuals return to the streets is no other avenue, no other opportunity into this self-perpetuating cycle. Whereas within the school system, you can make a significantly, though it sounds odd, significantly less of a fiscal investment from a state perspective, from taxpayers' money, to go ahead and result in significant increases in both educational levels and also mental health. So, I mean, it's one of those where we often talk about cuts in mental health and cuts in mental health provided within the school system. Yet, if we provide from transitional kindergarten all the way up through 12th grade, a robust system of mental health, along with just general education, but also a robust system of mental and emotional supports that are available that so many people don't receive. And it doesn't matter where you're at. If you're in Compton, if you're in Marin County, if you're in Imperial County, it doesn't matter where you're at, you have access to these. The cost is a fraction of what we spend for 1 year to create the situation that we have in California.
How much in your school district is spent per student per year?
We have currently, we're at just under $8,000 per ADA. So
what, $8,000 a year?
$8,000 is what we
serious?
receive. That's what we receive from the state and that's
a year?
That's if the student is an English language learner, and there's other unique components. The maximum amount we would receive as a district for one student, if they attended every day of the school year, would be $8,000.
$8,000 a year, and we're spending $70,000 a year for someone to be in prison.
Absolutely. And again,
that's
if we give them absolutely everything. If we get the maximum amount of money for that student and they're not absent a single day, then we'll get approximately $8,000. And then you see how much it costs for prison. I mean, it's just it's deplorable. But even if we were to go ahead and double our funding and say take that to 16,000 and have a large number of mental health professionals available and have counseling and do everything we possibly can with a broad system of networks, just by doubling it, you're still not coming to the monthly cost of putting somebody in prison in the state of California. So.
But we've known, but we have known this since, my entire life, since the 60s. And so a lot of what I see replay and the arguments and the discussion are nice, but we've known this forever.
Right.
And frankly, the prison system has gotten worse because we have private prisons. It's a for-profit situation. We've all read the books about how prison is just a new version of Jim Crow, because the vast majority of people in prison are Black and are expected to work at very, very meager wages. And it continues. And I'll be honest, if I live another 30 years, I doubt that things will be significantly different than they are today. A little bit at the margins, just like they're better today at the margins than in the 60s. But I think it's a great academic conversation. I'm sorry.
Well,
No, it's a great conversation. It's tragic, and I agree with you. We've talked about these topics forever. I mean, this has been part of the reason I got into. I had two different directions, to go into law or to go into public education, and I was debating which one am I going to do, and ultimately wound up doing public education because it wound up being one direction or the other, both kind of coming back to the same circle, the same cycle, the same discussion. I don't think that discussion was any different in the early 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, or today. And I hope in 10 years we make a difference. But
and by the way,
doesn't
you
seem
know
to work.
what? It was under Clinton that the Pell Grants were eliminated.
I was going to mention it's also not necessarily dependent upon political party. Some of the
No, not at all.
greatest
Equal
issues we've had have been.
No, because Willie Horton, no one wants to be responsible for a Willie Horton, which you guys probably know who
Yeah.
that is. The other day I was talking to younger people who did, my nephew, yeah, I was 29, didn't know who Willie Horton was, but no one wants to be seen as soft on crime, not to mention the fact that the police unions and the prison guards have very strong lobbies.
Which really influence the Democratic Party a lot, and
Mhm.
is why we have what we have in the state of California right now.
Yep.
I spoke at council on Tuesday. I was very offended by, I told the rabbi this, by Bianco demanding that they bring all of those sheriffs into Riverside when the
Oh.
city didn't ask for it, which was a horrible picture. And then they want overtime for us to pay, and they want a 7% pay increase. And because people are afraid right now, then they're able to maneuver more money. And it's a non-sustainable situation where we continue to invest on the back end instead of investing on the front end. And it's clear if we took care of 4-year-olds, we would do better.
Yeah.
But I don't know what it takes to get there. I guess what I take heart in is that you can get there one person at a time. So if you're teaching in school and there are some kids who do better because of what they got and the mental health access they got, or if they ended up going to a better school and they end up being able to mainstream into what we call normal society and pay taxes, then that's the best we can do as people. But changing the system, I don't see the system change.
So for those
Not
of
for
you,
a long time.
For those of you who don't see a picture of the person speaking, that's Melissa McKeith, who's an attorney. So
I chose being an attorney over.
okay, so you guys are each, well, you're both doing good, and we appreciate it.
Well, Melissa's name is really descriptive. I mean, it does say right on there, it's the iPad, and it is the iPad talking.
The iPad is talking.
Is it
yes.
really? So you can't see me?
No, just see your the top of your Apple.
Hold on.
But I'm reminded of a story.
Here I put lipstick on even. Okay,
I saw you before, but then you froze and we couldn't hear what you were saying. And now all we see is the top. It looks like a product placement.
What about now?
Oh, now we can see you. There you go.
Okay, I'm learning. The other thing that I find that happens during Torah is that it's like the broadband is slow sometimes. I don't know whether people have that issue also, where there's a lot of delay.
Are you using Wi-Fi?
Yeah, I am.
Well, that's the problem. I recommend that if you can plug directly into your modem, you will not have the problem. But unfortunately, with Wi-Fi, especially these days with everybody using Zoom, it's unstable.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have more trouble with these Zooms than many other ones. But I think most people only have Wi-Fi anymore. At least that's.
Well, but you can also plug in directly if you get a long enough cable or something. Okay, let's
go back.
Read a little bit more. Doug.
Oh my, where am I at?
Do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain, because the poor thing is going to want to eat, and that's really mean.
Sorry, I have to move you guys over again. It was covering up everything. So there we go. Do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders of the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of his town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, this is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled.
Okay.
Sorry, that just reminds me of something that happens in the South.
Really? So levirate marriage, you know, this is interesting when you think about the book of Ruth. Yeah, Lynn.
This is the first time I've noticed it says only if the brothers are dwelling together.
Exactly.
I never knew that before.
Exactly. Now, dwelling together doesn't mean that they have to live in the same actual house.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because you have, you know, families and clans living in the same sort of enclave. They don't have to be living in the same actual house, but, you know, close enough. But so that's what's interesting is that now, first of all, remember the story of Judah and Tamar. So Judah is one of Jacob's sons, and his first son marries a woman named Tamar, and something happens, and he displeases God, and he, you know, dies. So according to levirate marriage, his brother has to marry her, right? And the whole reason is to keep the line of the brother, right? The first son he had, the brother will have with the widow, is going to carry the name of the dead brother. So she marries a guy named Onan. Onan does not want to do this. He does not want to have a son that he has to take care of, who's actually going to really be his dead brother's son. So he spills his seed. Thus the word onanism. Okay, now he dies because God gets really annoyed about that, right? And now the third brother is supposed to marry her, according to levirate marriage. Well, Judah's a little nervous. What if the third one dies too, right? So he promises to Tamar that she will be able to marry this third brother, but he has absolutely no intention of giving him to her. Now, we just read about how if somebody is engaged, they are basically promised to this guy, they cannot marry anyone else. So this Tamar is now basically promised to this other guy. She cannot marry anybody else, so she waits and waits and waits, and he never is given to her. So what is she to do? She decides to take matters into her own hands. Because what does she need? She needs a father, a husband, or a son, right? So she goes and pretends that she's a prostitute, and Judah, after his own wife dies, goes and sleeps with her. But before they sleep together, she says, I need a pledge from you. Just like we were talking about all these pledges before, right? So he gives her the rope around his tunic and his walking staff, which are like the sort of credit card and driver's license of those days. And then he sends someone to redeem the pledge and to bring her a sheep or something in payment for the evening. And the guy who comes can't find her because she's no longer there. A few months later, Judah discovers that Tamar is pregnant. What is that, according to what we just all read? That she's committed adultery, right? If she got pregnant, she must have committed adultery because she's been promised to his son, right? What happens to someone who commits adultery? They get killed, right?
Yeah.
I think in this case she's supposed to be burnt. So he says she needs to be burnt when he finds out that she's pregnant. She, committed adultery. He doesn't know that he's the father because she was disguised. So she confronts him and holds the pledge, the rope and the staff, and says, the man to whom these belong is the father. Now, he could have said, I don't know what the heck you're talking about, right? But instead of that, he says, you are more righteous than I. He admits that it was him and that she had to take these matters into her own hands because he would not give his son to her. And wasn't
his son very young?
Well, but she waited until he got older.
Mhm.
Still didn't do it. And that is the ancestry of Boaz, who appears in the Ruth story. Now, Ruth, okay, Boaz wants to marry her. Why? Why does he want to marry her? Do you remember?
Oh, because
Because she
next
uncovered
one.
his feet, right? On the threshing bowl. On the
Well, I mean,
threshing.
he's attracted to her, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
he's also the next because of the Levirate marriage. He's the next. The first no, because the first one didn't want the first one. I don't know quite how to say this. The first,
Next of kin.
yeah, the first next of kin didn't want, and so he gave that responsibility to Boaz. Am I being too legalistic here?
No, you were following the trick that they did.
Oh, okay.
Okay, okay, so here's the deal. Naomi has a cousin of her dead husband, or we don't know. His name is Plony, which means so and so. No name, Plony, anonymous. So it turns out that there is a relative who is it's called a redeeming kinsman. He is responsible for redeeming some land that was sold by her family in order for them to survive. And so his obligation is to redeem the land so that she has the land, okay? If he refuses, then the next of kin is Boaz, and it's up to Boaz to do that. What Boaz does is he adds levirate marriage to the deal as a way to legitimize the fact that he's going to marry her, because she is a Moabite who is forbidden to Israelites. Now, is this a case of levirate marriage? Not at all. First of all, we're talking about Naomi. Naomi's the one whose husband died and whose land needs to be redeemed. He's not even talking about marrying her. And are either one of them a brother of her dead husband? No, there's no levirate marriage here at all. But they're using this as a way to legitimize this marriage. And the townspeople who are witnesses to this are kind of winking, like, yeah, we get it. Because they talk about Tamar and Judah in their blessing. May you be like, Rachel and Leah, and may you be like Tamar and, Judah. And they get it. They get the fact that this is kind of a twisted way of legitimizing it, because otherwise Boaz, who is a very prominent member of society, is, going to marry a Moabite. How does he explain that one? So it's not really a levirate marriage, even though that's how he sells it. And there is the whole thing with the sandal, because the Mr. Plony, who does not want to marry Ruth because he doesn't want to have to support some kid who is not going to be his own kid and who's going to inherit from him and all of that. So he takes his sandal off, and I guess she spits in his face or something. But anyway, and then it's all about Ruth anyway, and it has nothing to do with Naomi, and Naomi's the one that they're talking about. And then there's a kid, and the kid becomes Naomi's kid, and the whole thing is very complicated and strange, but that's the way they get around the prohibition. But we know how the rabbis get around it later, right? How do they get around the fact that Boaz married a Moabite? Anybody remember? They say that the law is that you cannot marry a Moabite, and in Hebrew, Moabite is in the masculine. They said it doesn't say anything about a Moabitess.
Oh.
It's always a way to redeem your ancestors if you really choose to. It's like when Abraham says to Sarah, when they go down to Pharaoh, because there's another famine, say that you're my sister. We never found out that they were related to each other. The rabbis say, oh yeah, he's not lying because actually they have the same father and two different mothers. Really? Who said that? But it's another way to, make sure that we don't say that Abraham is lying, God forbid, right? So, yeah, very complicated. All right, now we're going to start reading the rest of this, but the commentary is going to take us too long to read, so we're not going to really be able to finish it today. But let's go ahead and just read a little bit more. Doug, do you want to?
Two men, sorry about that. If two men are fighting and the wife of one of them comes to rescue her husband from his assailant and she reaches out and seizes him by his private part, she shall cut off her hand, show her no pity. Do not have two differing weights in your bag, one heavy, one light. Do not have two differing measures in your house, one large, one small. You must have accurate and honest weights and measures so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God has given you. For the Lord your God detests anyone who does these things, anyone who deals dishonestly. And remember that the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When you were weary and worn out, they met you on your journey and attacked all who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God. When the Lord your God gives you rest from all your enemies around you, and the land is giving you to possess all as inheritance, you shall blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget.
So we're going to go back to the business about the men fighting, but Amalek. So this is a people that treated us badly when we were going through the wilderness. And we're told to never forget to forget them. Never forget to blot out their names. So it's a strange kind of law there, you know, that you can never forget them, but you have to never forget to blot out their names because they were so awful. Amalek represents an evil person throughout our history. Haman is an Amalekite from the story of Esther and Purim. And supposedly the reason he exists is because King Saul was supposed to kill the king of the Amalekites, but he didn't. There was this is why Saul did not inherit the kingdom as a dynasty, because he was supposed to kill the guy. What happened was there was a battle and they, killed everybody except the king, and they took some booty, which they weren't supposed to take. And Samuel, the prophet, comes and says, okay, this is it. You're not going to, be able to continue on the throne beyond here. And I guess during that brief moment before Samuel kills the king, he has an opportunity to have a child because Haman comes from that line. But we don't even know if Haman ever existed. Then, of course, Hitler and all these horrible people of the world are supposed to be descended from Amalekites. I just want to see how much more I have in this commentary here. When a debtor does not repay. Okay, it's a long piece, and then Amalek. All right, we're going to have to meet next week to go over this and maybe some other stuff as well. So we'll have a Torah study next Saturday as well.
Rabbi Singer,
Yeah.
when you're on your 6-week vacation, are they going to do the Friday night service on Zoom? Are they
Yes,
going to
yes, it'll continue on Zoom. The problem is, I don't think it's going to be live streamed because of the unless someone can figure out how to do it because right now it's really totally connected to my computer and to my cell phone. And unless they can figure out some other way to do it, I don't know how it's going to get done, unfortunately. But it will be on Zoom, yeah. Randy's going to lead some services, and Jim Orens is going to lead some services. Any other questions before we?
Thank you.
Sure. But next Friday we have a service, and Saturday we have Torah study, and tomorrow at 2:00, Rick Landis is going to do a session on how to deal with stress. So,
Good.
yeah, if anybody needs the link, let me know. It was in the weekly email.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Shabbat Shalom. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Shabbat Shalom,
Bye.
everyone.
Everybody.
Shabbat
Thank you,
shalom.
Rabbi.